It's over. Those two words had never sounded heavier when they came from Sam Heughan, spoken not with drama, but with a quiet finality that immediately unsettled the room. What was meant to be a calm, controlled conversation suddenly shifted into something raw and deeply personal. The pause that followed felt longer than it actually was, long enough for everyone listening to realize this was not a rehearsed line. For years, Sam had mastered the art of saying nothing without seeming evasive. He deflected personal questions with humor, redirected conversations back to work, and maintained a distance that felt intentional rather than cold. Fans grew accustomed to that restraint, interpreting it as strength or professionalism. No one expected that the man who built his image on composure would one day allow it to fracture so openly. The moment itself was almost understated. There were no raised voices or visible tears at first, just a subtle shift in his posture and a tension in his jaw. He spoke slowly, as if testing each word before letting it leave his mouth. The simplicity of his language made the confession feel heavier, not lighter. Sam explained that silence had once felt like protection. Protection for the people involved, for the memories he didn't want dissected, and for himself. Over time, however, that silence began to feel dishonest, even suffocating. Carrying the weight alone had become more exhausting than facing whatever might follow. He admitted that endings don't always arrive with a clear breaking point. Sometimes they unfold gradually, disguised as patience, compromise, and hope that things will eventually realign. He described holding onto the belief that endurance equaled commitment, only to realize that endurance without connection slowly erodes everything underneath. That realization didn't come suddenly, but it stayed once it arrived. As he spoke, there was a noticeable shift in how people listened. This wasn't a celebrity controlling a narrative, it was someone finally relinquishing control of it. The room grew quieter, not out of shock, but out of respect. Everyone sensed that this confession had been delayed far longer than it should have been. Sam acknowledged the emotional toll of maintaining an image that no longer reflected reality. He talked about smiling through public appearances while privately feeling disconnected from the life he was presenting. That disconnect, he said, created a loneliness that was difficult to articulate, especially when surrounded by success. It was easier to stay quiet than to explain why everything that looked right felt wrong. There was no attempt to assign blame. He avoided specifics, not out of fear, but out of care. What mattered to him was the truth of the experience, not the details that could satisfy curiosity. The pain he described wasn't dramatic or explosive, but persistent and wearing, the kind that changes you slowly. At one point, his voice faltered just enough to reveal how close the emotions sat beneath the surface. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried more weight than tears ever could. He admitted that accepting the end felt like admitting failure, not just publicly, but internally. Letting go of something he once believed in required confronting parts of himself he had long ignored. The most striking part of the confession was how final it sounded without sounding bitter. Sam spoke with a calm that suggested exhaustion rather than anger. He didn't talk about regret in the way people expect, but about relief mixed with sadness. Relief that the truth no longer had to be hidden, sadness for what could not be repaired. As the conversation drew to a close, there was no immediate reaction. No applause, no gasps, just a shared stillness. It was clear that whatever had ended was not just a chapter, but a significant part of his life. That understanding lingered in the silence he left behind. For those listening, the shock wasn't rooted in scandal, but in recognition. Recognition that even the most composed figures can reach a breaking point, and that silence, when held too long, eventually demands to be broken. Sam's confession didn't offer closure, but it did offer honesty, and sometimes that is the most unsettling ending of all. Once the confession left Sam's lips, the impact extended far beyond that single moment. Clips spread quickly, headlines condensed his words into something sharper, more final, and fans were left grappling with an emotional weight they hadn't anticipated. Many expected clarification, perhaps a follow-up that would soften the meaning or reframe it. Instead, there was only silence, deliberate and unmoving. For Sam Heughan, that silence carried a different purpose than before. It was no longer about avoidance or protection, but about allowing the truth to exist without explanation. He had said what needed to be said, and anything more risked diluting it. That restraint confused some, but for others, it made the confession feel even more authentic. Fans reacted in waves rather than all at once. Initial shock gave way to sadness, then slowly to understanding. Many began to recognize the tone beneath his words, not dramatic heartbreak, but emotional exhaustion. This wasn't the pain of a sudden loss, it was the quiet grief that follows a long internal struggle. What resonated most was how familiar his experience felt to so many. People spoke about relationships that didn't end with betrayal or explosive conflict, but with a gradual fading that no one else seemed to notice. Sam's words echoed the kind of endings that are hardest to explain, because they look stable from the outside. In that sense, his confession felt less like a celebrity moment and more like a shared human one. Industry observers noted how rare it was for someone in his position to let an ending stand without narrative control. There was no attempt to reshape public opinion, no strategic messaging to preserve an image. By refusing to elaborate, Sam allowed space for discomfort, and that choice stood in contrast to a culture that thrives on constant clarification. It was a risk, but one that seemed intentional. Behind the scenes, reports surfaced of colleagues reaching out privately rather than publicly. The tone was not curiosity, but respect. Some described his confession as quietly brave, not because it was emotional, but because it resisted spectacle. In an environment where vulnerability is often monetized, his refusal to perform it felt significant. What lingered in the days that followed was a sense of unresolved emotion, both for him and for those watching. There was no promise of healing, no declaration of new beginnings. Sam didn't frame the ending as a necessary step toward happiness, only as something that could no longer be avoided. That honesty unsettled people accustomed to optimistic conclusions. Fans began shifting their language, moving away from questions and toward support. Messages became simpler, quieter, more reflective. Some thanked him for naming a feeling they had never been able to articulate themselves. Others admitted his confession forced them to reconsider their own silences. Sam remained absent from the conversation, choosing not to engage as interpretations multiplied. That absence was not indifference, but consistency. He had broken his silence once, and that was enough. Anything further would have turned something deeply personal into something consumable. Over time, the intensity of the reaction softened, but the unease remained. The confession didn't fade because it lacked drama, it endured because it felt unresolved. It challenged the idea that endings must be explained or justified to be valid. Sometimes, things end simply because continuing costs too much. In the end, what made his words so powerful was not what they revealed, but what they refused to resolve. Sam didn't offer answers, closure, or reassurance. He offered honesty, stripped of decoration, and trusted people to sit with it. That choice left a lasting impression, reminding everyone listening that some endings are not meant to be understood, only acknowledged. Sam remained absent from the conversation, choosing not to engage as interpretations multiplied. That absence was not indifference, but consistency. He had broken his silence once, and that was enough. Anything further would have turned something deeply personal into something consumable.